morning, everybody. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here with the Estonian Employers Confederation, our member here in Estonia. This is my first trip. I'm here for less than 24 hours, but at least it gives me a taste of what I think, by looking out of the windows, is a very nice city here in Tallinn at least. I'd like to thank you all for spending some time with me to talk about some of the issues that Thomas just introduced to you. And as he said, the issues that you are dealing with are common around the world. My organisation is a network of 150 countries. In that network are the most representative employer organisations in each and every one of them. And so we have at our tap a range of experience which is beyond explanation. It's huge what we can bring to the table if you ask. And I think it's important as we look for solutions moving forward, particularly from this part of the world and particularly within the context of the European Union, that you don't just look at yourselves. Look outside as to what is going on. The economic and geopolitical shift which is now moving to the east is something you have to factor in as we address the sorts of challenges that have been raised by your President of the Republic and your President of the Federation just now. And so it's important that we learn how some of these other economies, similar to yours, different to yours, are coping in terms of the competition and issues that they're dealing with, because they are very, very common. Now, what I've been asked to speak about is the issue of demographics. And there's a saying about old Metuusala. He lived to be 969 years old, apparently. Now, whilst we're all not yet at that age, the population of Europe and your country, as you mentioned, is clearly aging. And at the same time, fertility rates are dropping. So we have a perfect storm in terms of what this means for us. Over the next 50 years, life expectancy at birth is expected to increase by more than 7 years in developed economies. So if people are living 7 years longer in terms of the social costs of pensions, etc., the debate about people working longer before they retire becomes incredibly important. And what we are seeing, not just in Europe but around the world, is that people who have traditionally retired at 60, 65 are now living well into their 80s and sometimes even beyond that, and are actually living in poverty because the resources they were able to accumulate during their working life and the state pension they may be able to have advantage of is insufficient to keep them in a decent standard of living, which is increasing calls and further costs on government to keep topping up social costs. And it's just not a sustainable model. In the EU, the average old age dependency ratio, which is the ratio between the total number of elderly persons aged 65 and over and the number of persons of working age, 15 to 64, will double to 50% in 2050. That's tomorrow. 2050 is not that far away in terms of a policy construct. And so it is important that we start to look at these things. But you're not alone in an aging population. Even China will find that its older population will increase to 27.9% by 2040. In Japan in 2050, 1/3 of the population will be over 65. So again, the issues and challenges about how do you reinvigorate your labour market with an old population, with falling fertility rates, which means your workforce is not being renewed, is becoming crucial. And the issue was raised just before about robotics. Now, this always seems like a science fiction story when people talk about the capacity of robotics to impact our lives going forward. I don't think we are taking this seriously enough. If you look at some of these economies like Japan, the investment in robotics is colossal now in order to be able to fulfill the work requirements of a labour force which is not growing up anymore. We have to be thinking about robotics in terms of how it can impact your competitiveness. And I think some of the future thinkers that are out there looking at these issues are people we should pay attention to more closely and not look at it as science fiction, but look at it more as science fact. So demographic shifts will fundamentally change and challenge European societies in the years ahead. More specifically, it is obvious that this ageing of societies has deep implications on growth, on the supply of skilled workers, and as well on the stability of our social security systems. Just to give one example of Germany, the biggest European economy at the moment, according to recent studies, the skilled labour gap in Germany alone could grow to more than 5 million people by 2030 if targeted remedies are not implemented. 5 million people. Again, a colossal challenge. And that skilled labour gap means that they will be looking at other opportunities in the region to attract that labour to Germany. And that will come, possibly, at the cost of Estonia, as people will be attracted to opportunities outside of the country. So we have to be thinking in terms of responding to the skills challenge to look at a whole package of why people want to stay here. How can we keep them in Estonia even though there are good opportunities in Germany? That's going to be the challenge. What's your quality of life? What are the opportunities they have as individuals? What do young people want from life? And that's a different inquiry than what I've wanted from my life, or perhaps even you have wanted from yours. I talked to my 22-year-old daughter. Work is an adjunct to enjoying herself. It's not what she wants to do for the rest of her life. It's not the most important thing in her life. She looks for other attributes of the society in which she lives to stay where she lives. I have a niece who moved to Australia from New Zealand to have a better quality of life. She's coming back to New Zealand because she finds it difficult to live in a big city like Sydney with people who aren't New Zealanders, who aren't her family. So there are different things we need to be thinking about when we look at the issue of our skills acquisition in terms of the retention of the labour that we train, because this brain drain is a very big cost on a number of economies around the world. It's also true, of course, that in order to maintain the prosperity that Europe has had, we're going to have to maintain and improve our productivity and competitiveness. And we have to do it in different ways. You're never going to, in the short term, be able to compete with the labour costs of Asia. But that's where a lot of production still is and will continue to be. So what is the value add that you can bring that means the people that you have here and the work that they are doing is as productive, is as competitive as that from countries with lower labour costs? But you're not acting in a vacuum here. As I said, it's not just Europe that has some problems. There are other regions in the world like the USA, Asia and Africa that have younger populations. Africa, they keep saying they have a demographic dividend because they have such a vibrantly large portion of their population is young. But that dividend is not going to be delivered unless Africa is able to connect education, health, productivity and competitiveness to that demographic dividend. Otherwise, you're just going to have more people who are younger living in poverty. So again, the challenges in Africa are not small. The USA also has a young population. But also you have to look at the USA, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, that they have different sort of framework conditions to Europe. And again, this is the European model and how it translates and relates to a globalized world. In the past, when Europe was building this model, it was a little bit easier to think about yourselves as a region in isolation of everybody else. That's gone now. I think every business person in this room would recognize that the competition that they have in their business is not purely Estonian competition, that you have to be alert to and aware of those different frameworks that exist in different systems around the world. It is, of course, positive that people are living longer. I'm in no hurry to leave this life, and I think we have to see that as a real dividend of what we've been able to do as our societies. But we need to make sure that as we age, we maintain our focus on our competition. 2 years ago, German Chancellor Merkel stressed in this regard that Europe accounts for just over 7% of the world's population, produces around 25% of global GDP, and has to finance 50% of global social spending. So you can see there a distortion very clearly that is not sustainable going forward. And as that population ages, those costs, that 50%, is only going to go up. And so fiscal responsibility and the way in which we manage our spend on these issues becomes increasingly important. And I think it's very clear that we have to lower expectations on our populations as to what government itself can provide to people as they move into retirement, and to put the focus more on effective means and tax relief systems which encourage people to save themselves for their own retirement. And again, that's something we need to build into people's thinking at a very, very young age because of the costs of living older and living longer. It's clear from the crisis, and we've seen that in this region very much, that countries can't afford to have social security systems that they can't afford. You can't just keep borrowing money in order to keep these things alive. And that's a very difficult social discussion to have. And one of the advantages you have here in Estonia is a small population. It does enable you to have a more coherent conversation. Same thing in New Zealand. It's not too hard to start to talk about some of these issues, but you need to start talking about it, looking to engage not necessarily with proposals for solutions straight up front, but at least to start seeing how other people are viewing this as an issue so that you can actually start together to build a response. The understanding that the European social model can only survive with a strong European economy was also the main driver to refocus the EU Lisbon strategy in 2005. And I know the Lisbon strategy for an EU member state is an important document for you. However, I think it's clear that the failure of the Lisbon strategy is now very, very apparent. Despite increasing awareness of it, the strategy was not implemented consistently, neither at the European or at the national level. The reform programs at the national level were insufficiently ambitious. And this is a real problem we have today with our politicians with respect. Populism runs riot in the world today. Governments are looking at electoral mandates, they're looking 3, 4, 5 years in the future, that's it. They are responding to voice, which today with social media is a very strong force in our society. It is not engaging properly with the representative groups, like the Estonian Employers Confederation, who can bring to the table a legitimacy to the argumentation that they make. As I often said, my mother with a website can be just as influential as my organisation should she choose to use social media effectively. And that's a little bit concerning. Love my mother though I do, I don't necessarily want her views dictating the New Zealand's economic policy. But this is the thing we need to be thinking about in terms of how we engage on these matters going forward. We need to be ambitious in what we set out to do. We should not be shy about talking about the real questions and issues, and we should not be shy in raising these constantly, not only with government, but with society in general. As an employers' organisation, business is often very lonely in how it speaks. If you go to the other side, the left of the debate, there are a myriad number of other groups and actors who will speak for them. The church groups, NGOs, you name it, there's a lot of people out there. We need to find similar partners who can articulate our vision, our mission, our language, to inject it into a greater social debate where there's greater understanding. It's also clear, though, that as we look at the crisis slowly coming to an end, we hope, that a lot of the problems that were exacerbated by the crisis, such as youth unemployment, low productivity and competitiveness, existed before the crisis. And so it's very important to look at the policies that existed then, are now in place, and what is needed in the future very, very critically. Youth unemployment has always been higher than general unemployment, everywhere in the world for years. Growth, prosperity helped to mask that before 2009. Now we've seen it reach epidemic levels in parts of the European Union. Even here your rates will be too high. 9% unemployment is too high. But it's not just because of the crisis. And I think that's the other important debate to be having. You can't blame the crisis for everything. And at the same time, you can't blame business for the crisis. Business has reacted to the crisis in order to sustain itself. We're not the villains in this piece, but we have to be able to better articulate what those structural problems were, what we need to do about changing them. We must make sure we have more dynamic labour markets. We have to open up opportunities for employment and business development. We need to support growth and employment and make the European social model, if it is to survive, more sustainable. We have seen some really far-reaching reforms in Europe during the crisis. A lot of these reforms were not willingly undertaken, unfortunately. They were forced by circumstance. So the major reforms in Greece, the reforms in Spain, which were known as needed before the crisis. You talk to anyone in Greece, they knew you can't retire at 50. but they weren't prepared to front that issue until forced to do so. That's what we need to avoid. The sustainability of those choices those countries have made are vulnerable to populism. As things improve, there's a great chance the reforms will roll back, where in effect those reforms need to be deepened, made more widespread, and be reflected in other economies who so far can say we're all right. We're not too bad. Our growth's okay. We can get by with what we've got. That's not going to be an answer for the future. If you look around the world, though, there is also change going on. And the World Bank Doing Business report is a good barometer of that sort of change. And it's interesting to see that in other parts of the world, ambitions for reform are higher than in the European Union. There is a bit of smugness about the European Union. We're developed, we know best, we don't need to change. It's the developing world that has the problem. Well, be careful, because the developing world is catching up, and they are putting in place the reforms. There are only 2 EU countries in the top 10 economies with the best framework conditions for growth and competitiveness. There are 2, Denmark and the UK. Denmark number 5, UK number 10. Estonia is 22. Still a lot better than most, but not good enough. That's the other thing, the complacency of where we sit. We should be continuing to strive to make sure that Estonia is moving up the levels of having the best place to be. Because that's the challenge now. Why should I come here to invest? What makes you so special that I should go here and not to the UK or to Germany? That's the question we have to be able to answer today. Because at the end of the day, whether you succeed or fail, the world doesn't care about. It's like New Zealand. Where are we? We don't even appear on some maps. If you look at the globes that are created, New Zealand's not even there. And we're 4 million people. Estonia, 1.5. Puh. Your failure will be somebody else's success. That's the reality. That's how brutal it is out there now. So it is very important that as you look forward, you bear that in mind. You need to beat everybody else. And that's a real focus for politicians and for the lobbying activities of our federations, to be able to insist that government looks to better itself all the time. You can't just do a reform and leave it alone anymore. Reform has to be a constant process. The world is constantly changing. The impact of advancements in one country's environment on yours can be immediate. Little minor measures in tax rates and investment structures can mean that capital starts to move very quickly today. So you can't just say, oh, well, we did the reform, that's it now, we'll just leave it for the next 5 years. No, you can't do that. One of the other things that we've been doing in the IOE, and it's one of the responsibilities we have, is we're involved in the G20 process, which is, as you know, an intergovernmental activity which is looking at some of the fundamental problems of the world's largest economies. And what they are doing, though, it does not just affect the 20, it affects everybody, and I think it's important that we keep an eye on what the G20 is doing. So within the G20 structure, we have what's known as the Business 20, which is an attempt by the business community to keep on the agenda of the politicians the sorts of issues that we think are necessary to respond to issues like the demographic challenge, to create jobs and to stimulate growth. So one of the first things that we need to look at is, how do we make the most of what we've got? Migration is an easy panacea to problems. I know, we'll just open our doors and let everybody in, then we'll have the labour force, won't that be wonderful? No, because you're going to be competing with every other country that sees migration as a silver bullet, where they can just bring people in to replace and uptake jobs which are currently vacant. You need to make sure you're making the most of your own workforce, your own people. And that's important for social cohesion, but it's also important as a social responsibility we have as business to give jobs to the people of our community, because we are the community at work. We're not a group that arrives from Mars in the morning and leaves at night. We're the community at work. So make the most of what we've got first before you look at migration as that panacea. So one of the things is that we need to make sure that we look at the employability of our people. Kids coming out of school. What soft skills do they have? What's their work ethic? What's their approach to work like? How close are you to the education system? This is a key job now for employers' organisations. My own country in New Zealand, my organisation, we had businesses that we engaged with who actually adopted schools, high schools. And those employers would then allow those students to come into their business to see what work was like. And the employer went to the school and talked about what employers wanted from people to be employed. Because, of course, young people have no experience and can't get work. That's the big statement you hear. Well, a lot of them aren't even got the basic skills to be fit for work. They don't know about timekeeping, they've got no work ethic, etc., etc. So we found that that engagement at that level with the education system, with the teaching staff, to get them to come in and see how a business worked, was very helpful at getting kids to suddenly start to understand that life isn't going to give them something for nothing. They don't want to be trapped in low-skilled jobs is the first thing they find out, and it helps them channel themselves for future education into opportunities where there will be work, particularly the science and technology and maths streams of high school and university. So it's a very important step that we can take. So skills and education is important, but also at school we need to make sure that we are teaching things like innovation. We need to challenge our kids in terms of the complacency of some of the subjects that they are learning. How do those subjects now relate to the world of work? I'm not saying we get rid of classical education, but I'm saying we have to find ways to relate what they're learning to an employment situation, because it's only then that we're going to be able to close some of the innovation gaps that exist. And this is the other challenge we have. Things change very quickly. Education and training lags innovation because kids take a while to come through the educational process. But we need to narrow that gap as much as possible so that children coming out of their education system are able to come into work and be working on current issues, not the issues of 5 years ago or the technology of 5 years ago. That innovation gap is a key to competitiveness going forward. However, when you look around the world, every country has problems with this issue of skills acquisition. Everyone has skills deficits. And we have a responsibility as business to address this. We will often say to government, no, we don't have the skills in the labour market. The education system's not giving us what we want. Have you told them what you want? Are you clear about what you want? That is very, very important. We have to engage and identify the skills of tomorrow. Now, that can even be a challenge for business. Sometimes it's not clear ourselves in our business in 5 years where we will be or what needs we may have. But we've got to at least try to say to government where they should put their key focus on education. If, for example, we're going into the world of robotics, we need people who can build robots, service robots in the future, understand very highly complicated mathematics and technology solutions. Perhaps that's where we should be putting some emphasis in our education system. We're never going to get it 100% right. It's impossible. But at the moment, if we are simply just continuing to produce people who can't work, then all of the problems about the demographic challenge become even higher, and the sustainability of our systems become even worse. So what we've been trying to do in the G20 and the B20 is to come up with what we call a global apprenticeship network. This is a network of multinational companies who are coming together to share best practice about how apprenticeship systems work around the world, what are the barriers that they find in national legislation for the recruitment of apprentices. And I'm not just talking apprentices in the old electrical engineering and plumbing, etc. I'm talking new occupations as well. And we're finding that a very interesting catalyst for action. Again, it's a response from the business community to the skills challenge that we've raised with the G20. Business must now be part of the solution. We have to take control of this issue. We cannot rely on government to do this for us. So here in Estonia, what's your vocational education system like? Probably not that fantastic. probably not doing exactly what you want it to do. Go to the government and take it on. Say to the government, we'll run this. You give us some funding, we'll match some funding with you. We will go to the suppliers of our industry and bring into the vocational training schools the most current and innovative machinery, tools and training possible. And you find it works. We did this in New Zealand. I used to look after the printing trades training organisation, and we controlled it. And we went to Heidelberg in Germany and said, we want an 8-colour printer in our training school in Auckland in 4 months. If you don't give us one, we're not going to buy Heidelberg anymore. Do you know how quickly we got a Heidelberg press? Heidelberg even took the instructors from the vocational training organisation and trained them properly on how to operate that latest equipment. Now, the government had been unable to do that. They were still teaching them offset printing, which had gone out of existence as a skill 20 years before. But they only had offset printing presses. What's it like in your schools? So business needs to invest in this. And I know business often says, oh, it's going to cost money. Yes. Yes, it is. But you will get the benefit of having, coming out of those training institutes, the people you need to employ. We moved from a time-served apprenticeship system where after 3 years, regardless of how awful you were, you became a tradesman, to competency-based assessment. So we had smart kids coming through apprenticeships, not in 3 years, but in 18 months, but with the skills already in place. They could work from day one. And that meant that every kid in the printing industry, training organisation, had a job before they left. It makes a game changer. But you have to do this if you are serious about addressing the challenges of skills within your workforce in terms of being able to lift out of unemployment the people that you have. And you also need to be looking at that training for people in transitional parts of their employment career. Not just young people, but older people as well. As I said, people are going to have to work longer. We're going to have to keep them skilled longer to be able to work longer. And yes, that requires the investment. We need the enabling environment for business to compete and grow, and we've talked a bit about that. And your president this morning spoke a bit about the fact that what you've been doing up to now may not stand you in good stead for the future. And that's very, very true. And I think every country in the world is grappling with this. But strangely enough, in many instances, we've seen some countries take a higher regulatory approach, which have actually created further barriers to employment. What is your labour law like? Is it fit for purpose? What is your income policy like here? What's your taxation system, etc., etc., etc. All needs to be put on the agenda so that business is able to operate. Not with a cowboy's charter of no rights, no responsibilities, no cares. A level platform upon which you can compete. And again, that's a very important issue. And as I said, some countries in the world are doing a better job of it than others are. And that includes the diverse forms of employment. This is one that I find when I have to work in the ILO with the trade unions, they hate. New forms of work. Temporary, part-time, agency labour. These aren't new forms of work. They've been around for a very long time. What the unions don't like is they are getting greater uptake these days because the reality of the world is it's not always possible for an employer to employ everybody Monday to Friday, 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock. That's the reality. And we need to be able to ensure that our legislation, our rights systems, our pension systems, etc., are able to accommodate those sorts of transitional arrangements. Even Guy Ryder, the Secretary General of the ILO, admitted that these new forms of work are becoming standard forms of work, that the old is becoming the norm. And so again, what's your economy looking like with regards to that? How are you getting on with entrepreneurship in this country? Do people feel that starting a business is a good thing to do? How do you recognise failure in the system? If you look at the US, for example, if an entrepreneur fails in the United States, they are not dead for the rest of their lives. The banks won't blacklist them. They'll actually say, okay, you had a go, good on you. Let's help you again with your next idea. because it's only going to be with more companies that we're going to get more jobs. There is this belief that existing employers will employ more. No, that's not going to happen. You don't want the state employing more either. So you need a bigger private sector. And I'm sure, like my own country, New Zealand, where the majority of our businesses employ less than 10 people, you're an SME environment. You want more SMEs, ones that feel confident and capable of employing 1 or 2 people over time. Don't expect all these SMEs to become multinationals overnight, because many SMEs don't want to become multinationals. They want to be SMEs. But we need to encourage more people to see that starting a business is something that they will get support in, encouragement in, and it's a nice thing to do. Because again, we need to take that innovation of our young people and make sure that we are making the most of it. So I'm going to come to a close now, because I think I've raised enough issues for you, but I think it is very important that you have conferences like this where the business community can come together and start to talk about these issues. But please, with respect, I've been involved in employer organisations for 30 years. I have yet to hear a new argument when it comes to a conversation. Everybody knows what needs to be done. Come on. We know. Now, we're meant to be the business community. We're the smart ones. We're the ones that know best. Now is the time to apply that to the problems and challenges we face, to address the shortfalls we have in our own economy. So a call, and I say this around the world, to my members and the companies that make up my members: take control. Business has a very bad public profile at the moment. We are seen as the baddies. Even in the new Lego movie, the villain is a business. So our 5-year-old kids watching Lego movies are seeing us as the problem. That doesn't generate a lot of goodwill towards us and young people as they look to a career to go and work for the enemy. So we have a social responsibility to engage, a social responsibility to provide some answers, and a social responsibility to invest in the outcomes to generate the returns we want for our society. Thank you.